Hi guys, Goffy here and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk about this. This is the Leica M EV1. Has Leica completely lost the plot by removing the rangefinder from this camera? I was super fortunate that Leica sent me out to Italy to test this camera with a bunch of other creators pre-release. So in this video, I'm going to share those images, share my thoughts whilst we deep dive this camera. First of all, I think we should kick off with the name because the name is very intentional. This is not the M11 EV1 and it's definitely not the M12. I think there's a lot of emotion and worry that maybe Leica is getting rid of the rangefinder, but that is not the case. This is a new camera in their M lineup and they're going to continue to make rangefinder cameras. At its core, this camera is essentially a Leica M11 with a Q3 EVF on the top. So from an M11, we've got that 60 megapixel sensor with a triple resolution technology. We've got 64 gigs of internal memory. And we've actually also got content credentials that the standard M11 didn't get. From an EVF point of view, we've got the 5.76 megapixel unit out of the Q3. They did have to rework the optics a little bit to get that EVF to fit into an M body. And I'm super glad they did that because this camera has the same dimensions as an M11. We've lost the ISO dial on the top and they've also shaved an awful lot of weight off of this thing as well. I definitely underestimated just how much was going on in a rangefinder full of glass and how much weight that was adding to these cameras. So that weight saving is actually pretty substantial and I'll stick it on the screen now. And it also has some pretty substantial cost savings. I also underestimated the complexity of Leica creating the rangefinder. In US dollars, it works at about $1,900. For a euros and pounds conversion, I think it's around £1,000 less than the current M11P or the M11. And the black paint finish is the same as the standard M. It's that sort of matte black feeling, a bit rough to it, and it's not coming in silver. It's just coming out in black to begin with. And the other big important new feature of this camera is actually the frame selector on the front. Because you don't have an optical rangefinder anymore, this thing actually becomes a bit redundant. But instead what they've done is they've actually set it so you've got two different function buttons. Depending on which way you press this, there's going to be two different things you can set. And this will actually become super fundamental to how I found myself using this camera in the field. So I think that's enough about specs. Let's actually jump into exactly what this thing is like to use in practice. So out in the field then, what is this camera like to use? Now to be honest with you guys, when I first headed out with the camera, it felt really odd. My hands were telling me I had an M, but my eyes were telling me I had a Q, and really I didn't have either. What became evident very quickly was making use of this new frame selector on the front. I initially set it up so that I had focus peaking in one direction, so I could turn it on and off very quickly, and I also had it the other direction so it would punch in and zoom right in to help me focus up. Now once I'd set this up, I was surprised how quickly this became muscle memory and I became very accustomed to using it. And it felt quite natural. Looking through the camera and pressing this in became muscle memory surprisingly quick. I think this is going to be a problem that maybe Leica have, that you initially pick this camera up and it feels a bit odd. And it's only having used it for a couple of hours that you'll be surprised just how quickly it feels like it becomes a camera you've used forever. So let's talk about focusing with this camera, because the way I expected to focus with this camera and the reality ended up being two completely different things. And it all comes down to a downside with focus peaking with an M camera with a manual lens. Now on most traditional cameras, when you set your camera to focus peaking, what it's actually doing is setting your aperture to wide open and then quickly stopping down the aperture to whatever you set. Now because you're focusing with a wide open aperture and a shallow depth of field, focus peaking is super accurate. However, if you've got an M camera and say you're set to f8, when you're looking through the EVF, the camera just thinks everything is in focus. Trying to get critical focus is really hard. So what I found myself doing was for wide open portraits, I was turning on focus peaking because it was really helping me with those super shallow depth of fields. However, away from that, when I'm running around my camera normally at say f5.6 or f8, I actually found myself turning focus peaking off and instead just using this EVF to eyeball the focus manually by punching in. And I actually found that to be super accurate, partly because this EVF has such a nice resolution and a good brightness to it. So you might be sat there wondering, why would anybody want an EVF anyway, especially if you're somebody who loves the rangefinder? Now, I recently did a video when I was in Porto talking about the VisoFlex that attaches to the top of an M camera and actually gives it an EVF. And an awful lot of those reasons still ring true. Now, beyond what you see is what you get, so when you're looking through the EVF and the picture you take being the same thing, there are quite a few reasons as to why it might make sense. The one I could see people enjoying the most over the few days, and myself included, was using lenses that are wider or longer than a typical rangefinder supports. Leica had a 21mm Summilux available for me to loan at times, and I picked one up and absolutely loved using it. Now, if I was using my M11, I'd have to completely guess where the 21mm frame lines are when I'm looking through the rangefinder, or use the screen on the back. But trying to use the screen on the back and focus at f1.4 isn't particularly easy. Using it on this, the M EV1, that lens felt so natural to use. Being able to look through the EVF, easily see my frame, and focus up by punching in felt very natural. And I had a lot of fun with that lens, and I actually think it resulted in some of my favorite photos from the trip. At the other extreme, you had a lot of people enjoying some of Leica's really long lenses. There was a lot of people running around with 135mm f4s, actually finding them super useful and easy to use for the first time. You then also have a bunch of lenses that suddenly make a lot of sense that aren't rangefinder coupled, like the Leica R lenses and also some of the old screw mount stuff as well. Now, I'm somebody who has also considered picking up a Leica SL camera purely for this reason, so that I could adapt some of these wider and longer lenses, but instead you now have an option of still having an M camera and being able to do that. Another reason I frequently see down in my comment section is eyesight. I see an awful lot of you guys commenting, telling me that you love using an M camera, but your eyesight's got to that point where you just can't use a rangefinder anymore accurately. And now you've got an M camera with an EVF that fixes exactly that. You also have a diopter in there, same as the Q3, to be able to dial in your vision as well. So for many people, they'll know exactly that this is what they've been waiting for. So what are the downsides then to using an EVF over a rangefinder? Now, with the rangefinder, one of its really big perks is being able to see wider than the focal length of your lens, which can really help you when it comes to composing images. Now, you can kind of simulate that on here, but you're not seeing wider than your focal length, you're actually cropping into it instead. So you can add these frame lines to the EVF and to the LCD, but it's not doing the same thing. The other thing we noticed was down in sort of dark environments like the barrel storage of the Vineyard. Here, the ISO of the EVF ends up being very, very high to be able to give you a live feed. Now, because of that, when you then punch into focus, it can look like a bit of a noisy mess in really dark situations, where the rangefinder, it would have still been optical and it would have still been pretty easy to do. But I think for me, the bigger thing is probably around speed of use. Now, because this camera is based on the M11, it isn't the quickest camera to boot up. However, with the Leica M11, what I find myself doing is turning the camera on, and whilst the camera is booting, I can look through the rangefinder and I can focus and I can compose. And then by the time I've done those two things, the camera's normally ready to shoot. However, the difference here is when you turn the camera on and put it up to your eye, you have to wait for the EVF to boot up. So you're then waiting for the camera to turn on before you can compose, focus, and take the shot. So that first image takes a little bit longer. The second thing is the fact that you do need to punch in and then return back out to take a picture. That means every time you take an image, you have this additional step of that punch in, focus, which is the same, but then punch back out again. So for fast moving subjects and just quick photography, there's this like half a second extra activity that you don't have when you have a rangefinder. Now, how much this matters to you is going to vary so much on what type of photography you do. If you're someone who's doing fast-moving street photography, it'll probably feel quite annoying. For me, who is someone who does travel, lifestyle, landscape photography, that extra step and that extra little bit of time to turn on really didn't affect me at all. But depending on what you're shooting, how much that matters to you is definitely going to be a hot topic. So personally, am I going to head out and buy one? Now, I've actually held off buying a Leica Q3 because I knew this was coming, and I thought that those two cameras were going to overlap. The reality is they're just two completely different cameras, and there's good reasons as to why you would own either of them. I then look at my Leica M11 and I think to myself, you know what, I love my Leica M11 because of the benefits that the rangefinder gives me. So ultimately, this camera isn't really a good replacement for either of those. Instead, this camera makes a lot of sense in the lineup as well, as a supplement to the setup rather than a replacement for something else. But I have another camera that's a bit like that, my Leica M10 Mono. I use that for a bit of fun and it doesn't really offer me that much. So maybe I'll get rid of the M10 Mono for one of these in the near future. But ultimately, regardless of whether I'm buying one, I can see the market for this camera. There are so many people out there that have been asking for exactly this. It might be people that have got bad eyesight that can't use an M anymore, but want the feeling of using one natively with M lenses. It might be wide lenses, it might be long lenses, it might be vintage lenses that don't rangefind a couple. There are so many reasons as to why this camera makes sense, even if it's not for you. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this isn't replacing the rangefinder at all. This is a new camera in the lineup. The M cameras will continue to have rangefinders into the future. If you've enjoyed this video, guys, please do not forget to like and subscribe. It really does help support the channel. I've got a lot more content coming on this camera, along with a bit more of a deep dive into this Italy trip as well. I learned so much from this trip, from all of the people that I met there, and I just want to share some of my thoughts about that trip with you. It's got a lot of value in there, and it's coming out very soon. Thank you guys for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.